I'm here now with Corinne Ball, partner and co-head of the Global Business Restructuring and Reorganization Practice of Jones Day. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And you're one of our experts on the European take on all the distressed investments right now. What kind of activity are we seeing in Europe and how has it changed?
Well, we're actually seeing the players in Europe change. The new sources of capital in Europe are clearly coming from American managed funds. And they are very much of a player in Europe. But there's been some issue, primarily because the Eurozone banks are on their heels. They cannot provide new capital. So there's been a vacuum, if you will, and these American distressed investors have really raced to try to fill the vacuum. As with many other sweeping or sudden descending kind of changes, there have been some very successful stories in doing that, and there have been some very problematic ones.
There are risks. So if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. You have to remember that Europe, I have never met, to quote Wilbur Ross, a European. I have met an Englishman, I have met a German, I have met an Italian. Their legal system, similarly, is very distinct. What you can do in one place, you can't necessarily do in others. The good news is that many legal systems, by virtue of the persistence and the productive contributions of the American distressed investing community, have changed to promote new investment and promote capital in distressed communities. I would say Germany has made vast changes in their law, largely brought about by American investors. Spain has also made large changes, again, brought about by American rescue investors. So that's all good. What's bad is if you don't really have people on the ground and you're not aware of the risks. Pension risks, for instance, in the UK. You're not aware of the system that doesn't give you a day in court if you think you were wrong. So I think the risks are to be aware of the ins and outs of each jurisdiction in which you're investing.
Can you give us maybe a couple of examples of particular sectors and particular countries that might be a little hotter right now?
Right now, I'd say that there are three very hot areas. One, we all have to pay attention to the financials. The financials, though, are only for the very stout at heart and the very large. Wilbur Ross, as you know, is a major investor in Northern Rock, Bank of Ireland, and he's been very successful actually investing in a government-owned bank, which is a very interesting negotiation. So I would say financials are big, not only for investing in financials, but also for buying bank assets. Large American funds have been able to buy portfolios of loans. It's almost like becoming a bank in Europe, and rather than doing it organically, you just buy a huge chunk of bank assets, and suddenly you're on the ground and you're in these companies. Now, it's not as easy as it sounds, but I think that that has been very interesting, the financial play. Going in with the government to own a reorganized and rescued financial, or buying bank assets just at Wells Fargo, to have a presence in Europe that you haven't theretofore had. So I think financials are far and away the most fascinating play, but you need to be extremely sophisticated.
What about the year ahead? You know, the rest of 2013, what changes do you see? Any recovery on the horizon, any stabilization in Europe?
Yeah, recovery, stabilization are kind of judgmental words, as if there is one word that would cover
and
this patchwork quilt of what's going on. I think the answer has to be that there is a lot of capital willing to go to work in Europe. It's largely coming in from the United States. It's looking for yields in the 8 to 12%. And I think what we're going to witness in Europe is a willingness to accept it. It has not been easy for these investors to find opportunity. Banks have been amending and extending, and if you will, ostrich, their head in the sand, and not really fixing business. But I think management in business is realizing, how do you run a business year after year in stasis, waiting? And I think if they see that new capital out there that wants to come to work and a willingness on the part of the banks perhaps to welcome it, I think we'll see a little bit more of that, less hostility, if you will, from the European banking community to investors that are comfortable with distress.
Have you noticed that on a personal basis? Are you seeing that change in sentiment?
Yes. Yes, you're actually seeing European banks, they sold these massive portfolios of assets. And the first thing they all did, and this goes to my point, I've never met a European, is they sold assets that were loans to borrowers outside their own country.
Okay.
So the Irish sold the loans to the English and the French. The French sold the loans to the English and the Irish. The English sold the loans that were made outside England. Germany sold loans that were made outside Germany. So we are now beginning to see a more rational development about what makes sense. And so, yeah, I think we've seen a lot less hostility and more of a rational approach. We now have, for instance, major UK banks actually selling what in the vernacular we call single credits, which would mean their loan to a particular company. They're doing that in troubled sectors like shipping. And I think it must be because they have recognized that their shipping loans are likely far underwater and their resources are better deployed elsewhere. So at least in shipping, media, telecom, specialty chemicals, I think we're seeing some movement where banks are realizing this is embedded capital. I'm a bank. I'm supposed to make short-term commercial loans. I'm not supposed to be the equity in this company. And so they've been a little more welcoming of a sponsor and a new solution. And that, I think, is recent.
Very interesting.
So we'll see more of that. I think there'll be some great opportunities.
Corinne, thank you so much for
You're
spending time
welcome.
with us today. Great to
You're
talk to
welcome.
you.